March 10th, 1945. 381,300 cluster bombs were dropped on Tokyo. Japanese houses at the time were almost all made of wood. In that single day, a third of Tokyo burned to the ground. My mom lost her family and home in that raid. She had to move to Yokosuka and live with her cousin. The B-29s kept on coming, razing other major cities throughout Japan without mercy. Then, in August, they dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered to the United States at last. After that, Yokosuka was flooded with American soldiers come to occupy the country. My mother was still in her mid-teens, and she learned from her cousin how to survive in that town, by servicing the troops. That's how she met my father, and how I was born. My father was an officer serving with the government section of Allied GHQ under General Whitney. Whitney was known as MacArthur's shadow, and my father rode his coattails to a pretty high rank. While he was in Japan, he treated my mom like a wife. After he went back to the States, though, she never heard from him. I wasn't born until after he went back. My mom raised me as a single mother. She used the money my father left her to open a shop selling cigarettes and stuff to occupation troops. It was a decent living, but I didn't have citizenship. They're working to change the law now, but back then if your father was unknown, you couldn't get onto the Japanese family register. And in Japan, that means you can't be Japanese. So as I watched the American soldiers around town, I said to myself, I'm a son of America, the victor. My hair and eyes were different from the skinny, downtrodden Japanese around me. I told myself I'd leave this country someday and return to my true homeland. When I was around 10 years old, my mom fell ill, pretty much leaving me to run the shop in her place. One day I found a single picture of my father in the back of a drawer in the shop. I'd show it to the American soldiers who came into the store. A few years went by before one of them told me who he was. I know him, that's Miller. I started asking other guys, do you know where Miller is now? Can anybody tell me where Colonel Miller is now? Turns out he'd left the service and was making a living as an instructor for soldiers in Virginia. It was one of his students who finally told me that. I wrote him a letter in English. I'm your son. I want to go to the United States. Day after day I waited. Then just when I was about to give up, the post office delivered my future to the door. My father sent me some money. I thought my dream was going to come true. I was only thinking of myself. So I went to my bedridden mother and convinced her to let me go. My father arranged for a car to pick me up. It was jet black. When the neighborhood kids who'd always made fun of my hair saw it, their jaws practically hit the ground. I put my mom in a hospital and went on my own to America. When I met my father for the first time, he was living alone in a big house. He told me he'd lost his son, his American son, in Vietnam. He showed me a picture of my older brother. I guess that and his divorce left my father feeling lonely, which is probably why he finally took an interest in me. He'd retired from teaching. He was stooped over, could hardly walk, but he gave me two things: the name Miller and money for school. I used it to learn English and then go to college. America was exhausted from years of fighting in Vietnam. They were waging war in a foreign land, while at home, people were screaming for peace. Right after I graduated, I went back to Japan, alone. My father refused to see my mom. It was the first time I'd seen her in years, and she wouldn't even look at me. At first, I thought she was mad at me, but that wasn't it. Disease had taken her mind. A disease she got while she was young and desperate. She didn't even know who I was. I said, Mom, it's me, Kazuhira. As I spoke, the sound of my own voice rang in my ears. Katsuhira, the name my mom gave me. It means peace in Japanese. I was Japanese. At least, I was the son of this tiny Japanese woman. It was then, for the first time, that I understood the reason, the emotion that inspired my mother to give me that name. She'd watched her hometown and family go up in flames. Her body and her mind were ravaged by war. And yet she chose to have a child named Peace, with a man who was once her enemy. Japan lost the war. But what good is war as a measure of a country? Since the war and up until the oil shock last year, Japan's economy has grown every single year. It's on its way to becoming a stronger country than ever. I stayed in Japan and joined the JSDF. I was 22 at the time. I did it to pay our bills. But it wasn't just that. I could have found work anywhere. And I knew it. And still, I couldn't think of anything else to do with myself. 2 years later, I didn't have to worry about Mom's hospital bills anymore. I left the JSDF and went back to the States. My father was already dead and buried. I was told he'd shot himself in the head. America crushed Japan, but it also crushed my father. My American dream was over. After that, I drifted around and, well, you know the rest. GHQ made women like my mother. It made Japan's peace constitution and the JSDF. And it made me. I was spawned by war, but I don't want to die in one. I won't die for a country, and I won't live like a pauper. I won't have my fate decided by some family register. So as long as I stick with you, boss, I've got a good feeling none of that will happen.